Thanks for coming along and braving the slightly blustery weather outside. I'm Chris Yu, head of the Digital Government Unit at Policy Exchange, and I'll be chairing this evening's event on politics in the age of social media. So in a slight change to advertised schedule, James Forsyth can't be with us, but you've got me chairing, and that means more time for the panel to speak and more time for all of you to ask questions. So I hope it's a reasonably happy outcome. Now, we put this event on this evening to talk a bit about how the internet is changing the political arena. There's no doubt that the internet and the web is changing the way that we communicate. Pretty sure everyone in this room will be used to using email, websites. Most of you on Facebook, on LinkedIn, perhaps on Twitter, who knows. What we wanted to do is explore what all of this means for politicians, for political parties, the organisations that work with them. And our panel this evening is rather illustrious. So we have Alberto Nardelli, founder of Tweetminster. Tweetminster is a service which, media platform, helps people and organisations discover the most relevant content, trends and insight around their personal and professional interests. Alberto was also a member of the Electoral Commission's Political Parties panel from 2000 to 2009. And he edits the Election Law channel, the only site covering UK electoral law. And when I did the count of Twitter followers earlier today, Alberto, you were in the lead. Simon Milner is UK Policy Director for Facebook. He's responsible for Facebook in the UK on issues such as privacy, safety and advertising. Simon joined Facebook in January this year. Before joining Facebook, he was in a senior role at BT. He's also spent time on the board of the Authority for Television on Demand and worked at the BBC advising on strategic, regulatory and governance issues. Mark Pack is with us this evening. Mark is Head of Digital at MHP Communications and was previously the Liberal Democrat Head of Innovations, where he ran the party's 2001 and 2005
lifetime ago
internet general election campaigns. And of course, many of you will know Mark is co-editor of Liberal Democrat Voice, which is the most widely read Liberal Democrat blog in the UK, and he's also a member of the Open Rights Group's Advisory Council. And joining us shortly will be Julian Huppert MP. I'm sure Julian needs no introduction to this audience. I think in today's list of the 50 most influential Liberal Democrat MPs published in Telegraph, Julian ranks number 20. And on the infographic that was on your chairs, in terms of most influential MP by clout score, Julian ranked number 4, which is pretty good going, right? Mentioning the infographic, that was put together by a company called Yatterbox, who are with us in the room as well. They're running the interactive on the projector here. Yatterbox is a social media monitoring platform for discovering what politicians and others are talking about. We'll be updating the page as we go, depending on where the conversation runs, and if you want to talk to them afterwards, then there's a representative here. Now, the way the session will run is I will give the panel 5 to 7 minutes each to share their perspectives on the topic, and then I'll open it up to questions and answers from the audience, and we'll try and wrap up in about an hour or so. If you want to tweet about the event as it goes, and that would be pretty appropriate given that we're doing an event on social media, then our hashtag is PXConf. Now, just before we get started, I was going to put down a few thought starters which maybe the panel might like to pick up on and you might like to think about before we get to questions and answers. So really 3 things from me. Number 1 is about how much of the noise and the activity that we hear about social media and politics, how much of that is really substance and how much of that is terribly exciting in the moment, but actually on balance when we look back, a lot of it is trivia. We see lots of trends shooting up the rankings on Twitter and on other social networks, and it seems to me that oftentimes those die away fairly quickly. And I kind of am wondering whether all of the activity that we see is really insightful conversations, or whether it's more about actually brilliant for following the latest gaffe as it happens in real time, but maybe less on the substance of the policy conversations. And if that's right, then how do we get better at that? The second thought starter I wanted to put into this was around the role of information. People have talked about social media, the internet, generating an enormous quantity of data which can be used for targeting messages, for communicating with voters. Every time we buy something online, we click a like button, we tweet about something, we generate this data exhaust, which there are companies out there who are collecting that data up, mining that data and using it to understand how we better target messages. Some people say that this is a brilliant innovation, that it gives parties and politicians the ability to target their messages very finely, to tailor communications for individual voters and citizens. Other people say that this is pushing us more and more towards a world in which debates are polarised, in which the best way to boost turnout or to increase engagement is actually to find someone's red button and push it. And maybe that's not brilliant for the state of social discourse in the UK. It goes to this broader point about what some people describe as the filter bubble. So if every social network and every internet search engine gives you the results that it thinks you want to hear, how do we know that what we're listening to is a balanced conversation? And what do we do about it? And the last thing that I was going to just throw into the mix was around some fairly old-fashioned internet activity. So we get caught up in Twitter and Facebook and all of the social networks. Right at the bottom of this is MPs and their websites, and a lot of those actually, at a basic level, aren't that spectacular. So I like to think that I'm reasonably engaged in the policy debate. I'm reasonably engaged with technology. I confess up until this morning I'd never looked at my MP's website. I thought in the spirit of the event this evening I would look it up and see what was there. So I googled my MP and I looked up his page. And it was kind of okay. It wasn't super slick, but it was functional. It had some news updates. And then down at the bottom it had a great big banner which said, reminder, there are no MPs because the general election has been called. MPs will be coming back to Parliament after the election on the 6th of May 2010. Watch this space. Now, maybe that's that's an isolated example, but it tells you a little bit about where we are in terms of engagement with some of the parties. So on that note, and Julian can maybe talk about this when he gets there. I checked his website out as well, and it was pretty good and up to date. So, so he's safe. But I will hand over maybe to Alberto to kick us off with a few perspectives, and then we'll go to Simon and Mark.
Hello. So I want to talk a little bit about, so we launched Tweetminster at the end of 2008, and I want to talk a little bit about how politics, specifically on Twitter, has changed over the past couple of years. A few weeks ago I was asked to write an article about Twitter and the election in the US and various tools that were being developed to follow the election. And I started thinking about how things have changed since we launched Tweetminster and the work that we did during the election. So when we launched here in the UK, there were 4 MPs on Twitter. There are now more than 360 MPs on Twitter. And we did lots of various things in the run to the election. So I think we were one of the first organisations to interview head of government on Twitter. We built maps to see where the parties were campaigning, looked at trends and sentiment analysis. One thing I noticed was that over the past couple of years, in terms of product innovation, not much had actually changed. There weren't that many new ideas. The biggest innovation, I think, in terms of Twitter and politics has been the fact that it is now mainstream. So it's the size of Twitter. There are over 10 million active users on Twitter in the UK. I remember when we launched, we had lots of conversations with journalists saying, what's the point of this Twitter thing? And now the majority of them are not just on Twitter, but are tweeting every few minutes. We spoke to lots of MPs, and lots of MPs were very cautious about using the tool, asking what the point was. I remember having a conversation with a specific MP who said that Twitter was pointless, and now he tweets every couple of minutes about his thoughts on Europe, especially. I don't tell you what party he's from. And I think that consolidation, that the fact that the majority of people no longer ask, is it useful, is it not useful, should we use it, should we not use it, and the fact that it is part of the conversation, I think that has been the biggest shift in the past couple of years. In terms of the trends which I think have emerged, so in terms of what are the ways that Twitter has influenced politics over the past few years, I think they can be summarized through various angles. So the first is in terms of monitoring news. So the impact that Twitter has in terms of where people that create news and are influenced by news, where are they getting their information? Twitter plays a central role in that. And that's important for various reasons. It's important in terms of how we're influenced by the news that we receive, because if we see a certain story, we are more or less informed. It has an impact in terms of the perception that people have in terms of stories, because if a certain angle is more widely read versus another angle, that angle is likely to have a bigger impact in terms of shaping public opinion. Another trend which has emerged is amplification. So I think one of the key characteristics of Twitter is that it amplifies things. And it amplifies things positively when there's a nice story, and it amplifies things negatively. So when there's a negative story, it becomes very, very quickly and very, very big, and everyone starts to talk about it. To give you one example, when we post something on Twitter as Tweetminster, 90% of activity, and that could include 100, 150 retweets, happens in less than 5 minutes. And that has very practical implications in terms of the rapidity with which news spreads, in terms of the window in which people affected by that news story have in terms of intervening, in terms of engaging, in terms of putting their opinion out. You have much less time to do things. And another element, which is one of the bits that I like the best about amplification, is that it amplifies our values and our characteristics as human beings. I think if someone is a nice person, eventually that niceness will be amplified on Twitter and it comes out. If someone has more questionable opinions, say for example, just to use a random example about the opening ceremony at the Olympics, I think eventually that opinion will come out in a moment in which you reply to something very, very quickly, or you put out you put out a post because you've had a little bit too much to drink that evening. And I think that's a very powerful shift because it shows the true nature of individuals and organizations over time. Another element, I think, is the ability to communicate directly with people. So if we think about a world where Twitter or Facebook didn't exist before, the way we discovered events were always through the eyes of someone else, through a journalist, for example, or through a friend who had seen something happen. I think one of the biggest, one of the most powerful elements of social media is that for the first time in history, we have direct access to people who are shaping a news story. And to use a practical example, a few months ago we were covering with the BBC elections in 6 different countries. And for the first time, you could see the opinions of people who were voting in Armenia and posting pictures of, they were going to the polling booths in Armenia and posting about what was happening. Previously, we had no way of connecting with people directly in Armenia. We would find out there was an election there because we saw it in the newspaper or saw it on the news, but we would always have that mediated view of that event. Another element, I think, is the influence on media, and not just in terms of direct influence, so in terms of where journalists are directly getting their news, but I think the much more powerful is the indirect influence. So the way journalists are sourcing stories, are finding guests for programs, are finding facts and figures which they then report on. I think that's had a very powerful impact in terms of media. It has had a very powerful impact in terms of taking what happens on Twitter doesn't stay on Twitter. It's taken off and reported elsewhere. It's amplified. You have a guest, say for example on Newsnight, or facts and figures which a journalist finds. So it's become embedded within the shift from a news cycle to a news stream. Finally, I think the creation of a level playing field, and by level playing field, I don't necessarily mean from a democratic perspective, but a level playing field in terms of any individual can have influence on that platform. So any individual organization can create their own media outlet to express their opinion, to generate rebuttals when they're in the news. They no longer have to go to an organization or to someone and say, can you help me get this position out there, or I'm an expert in this thing, I would like to comment on this. It creates that level playing field where individuals, we have a much wider scenario of organizations and individuals who are part of that media platform. And I think that has also helped politicians incredibly. There are so many politicians who previously members of the public would know very little about, who wouldn't often be in the news. Oftentimes they get in the news for the wrong reasons when it comes to social media, but independently of that, you have lots of politicians who are able to express views, and those views are reported in the media, and otherwise those views would not be reported. And I think with all of that comes various shifts and challenges. So one of those I think is in terms of emphasizing the importance of judgment. So when something trends on Twitter, it seems like it's the most important thing in the world. But oftentimes it's the most important thing in the world for 5 or 10 minutes. So from a political perspective, or from a news perspective, the challenge there is, do we intervene? Do we react to this? And that's fundamentally down to judgment, because in that moment in time, that thing seems like the most important thing in the world because it's trending and everyone is talking about it. But oftentimes after 10 minutes, something else will be trending. And finally, I think something else which has is a consequence of social media, Twitter and Facebook in particular, is the notion of memory and history. So things that we share on Facebook when we're in high school or in university, things that we say on Twitter 2 years ago, videos of speeches, etc. They're there forever. And politically, from a political perspective, that has enormous consequences, because you might find yourself in 5 years' time running a campaign, saying something, and someone said, look at this video, what you said 5 years ago, and look at this picture of you on Facebook, which contradicts what you're doing or you're saying now. And I think that notion of memory in time will have a very profound impact in terms of politics.
Okay, Roberto, thank you. Julian, welcome. Okay, Alberto, thank you very much. I'll pass over to Simon from Facebook.
Thank you very much, Chris, and I'm very pleased to be here. I've been in quite a lot of rooms like this over the last 4 or 5 months, from as far afield as Folkestone and Glasgow and Barnsley and Sheffield, but actually not talking to a political audience, but talking to a small business audience about how they can use Facebook to better engage with their customers, potential and current customers, and then grow their businesses. And actually it's very interesting the parallels between the world of business and the world of politics in terms of thinking about the power and the difficulties of social media and how you can best make use of them. And I guess I'd say within those different events that we've been running in association with Chambers of Commerce around the UK and in Ireland, kind of 3 broad questions have come up. Why should I bother with Facebook? Who are the rock stars in terms of how well they're using Facebook? How can I use it to engage more effectively with my customers? And actually many of the things that we say to small businesses absolutely apply for politicians as well. In terms of why bother, well frankly if you don't bother, then you're missing a massive opportunity to engage with the population. The Facebook at the moment has around 31 million active users in the UK. It's one of our biggest and most important markets, and half of those Facebook users are using the service every single day. And actually, those of them that are using our mobile, and I hope many of you are around the room at this moment, are even more engaged than the person who is using it on a desktop. So the move to mobile is very good news from Facebook perspective, and very good news from the perspective of people who know how to use Facebook effectively to engage with their audience. And then the second aspect of why you should be using it is impact. Facebook essentially creates word of mouth at scale, and everyone knows that the most important influencers on anyone are their friends. What do their friends think about any particular issue is much more likely to impact what they think about it. So some research from the Pew Center in the US showed that people are 57% more likely to persuade somebody around their vote if they are friends with them on Facebook than if they connect in any other kind of digital way. And one of the reasons why Facebook is particularly powerful is because of our real name rules and authenticity. So most of the time, for the massive majority of people on Facebook, they actually know the person they are in contact with in the real world, and they know this is a real person. And that makes a massive difference in terms of trust and willingness to, if you like, be influenced by the people you're in contact with. So who are the rock stars? Who's really doing very well on this front? I thought rather than kind of single out individual parties or MPs, it may be worth looking outside of the UK about who's using Facebook well. Let me just give you 3 examples. We see plenty of examples of US politicians using the ad targeting tools in Facebook to do micro campaigns, to really home in on people in an individual borough or an individual town and provide messages to them that are absolutely targeted to what is going on in their patch. And Facebook's ad targeting enables you to do that. When Christine Lagarde was running for the presidency of the IMF, she conducted a Facebook Q&A with people around the world to ask her what she thought of the key issues around international development. And that was really important in terms of demonstrating that when she went for that role, she was able to represent or kind of reflect the views of people around the world. We also got the example of the Danish tax authorities who used lovely pictures of institutions and organisations and buildings and people who've been helped by government spending to make the case of why people ought to pay their taxes. Very important, particularly for this audience. And then finally, of course what people really come to our roadshows, if there are small businesses, they want top tips. What are the top tips for using Facebook in order to grow my business, to engage with people more? Let me give you the 4 that we give them. Your Facebook page, so this is assuming you are an elected official or representing an organisation, is the key here. It has to be, it's your mission control, it's how you are represented on Facebook. And you need to nurture it and you need to build it, you need to use really attractive content so that people, when they come to your page, they want to stay there, they want to engage with you. You should be using advertising to engage new people. So don't rely on the people who already like your page. Think about what are the kinds of people I think should be coming to my page who are not coming to my page. We have some, as I say, highly targeted, very cheap advertising which you can turn off if it's not working, and really focusing on the people that you're not currently reaching. It's definitely not a broadcast arena. This is an arena in which you need to be referencing out to other people's content. Actually, much more interesting to highlight other people's content rather than your own. And then make those connections. And it's when you get that web of connections around your page and the people who are liking that page and their friends and their friends that you can really get momentum. And the final kind of insight is use the insights tools. So one of the things that Alberta said, in fact, Chris talked about this idea of digital exhaust. Actually, what the insights tools on a site like Facebook enable you to do is to say, I can figure out which particular type of content really engages my users. Is it the photo of the MP down the local hospital, or is it the photo of the MP with her family? that's really going to engage the audience and drive them to it. If I run a small poll on my page around a particularly vexed issue at the moment and see what people think about it, does that really engage people? So you can see those insights immediately, and actually from your mobile device now as well. So we did the most recent event we did. Actually, the recent event was in Folkestone, which was an experience. But before that, we were in Dublin, and we had the Minister for Jobs and Enterprise, Richard Bruton, spoke at the event, and he characterised. He made the connection between businesses wanting to engage customers and politicians wanting to engage citizens and then eventually voters. And he talked about the scenario that in the old days, it used to be about printing out 1,000 leaflets, getting your volunteers out to drop those leaflets through letterboxes, and you might be lucky. You might get one person out of those 1,000 leaflets who will actually be influenced by that leaflet and may change their vote or change their opinion on an issue. Now, he said, the key is maybe reaching one person who is so convinced by your message that they will then talk about it to their friends, and those friends will talk about it to others. And by that clever move, you could be reaching 1,000 people having reached one person, and they will do the work for you. And that's the power of social media for politicians. Thank you very much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. So we've heard the view from Tweetminster, we've heard the view from Facebook. I will pass this over to Mark to give us the view from the blogosphere.
Yeah, I guess in terms of trying to understand why politicians sort of do what they do and don't do what they don't do online, there's sort of one underlying statistic that's nothing to do with technology that I think explains a lot of it, particularly going back to, I think, one of the comments Chris made earlier. And it's simply, if you look at individual constituency election results over the last 40 years, and if you think how much has happened in the last 40 years, in Britain in terms of Labour landslides under Blair, Tory landslides under Thatcher, huge change in the political environment, rise of nationalist parties, fall of nationalist parties, rise again, rise to third, huge amounts of political change in Britain over the last 40 years. Half the parliamentary constituencies in the UK have not changed hands between parties at a general election even once in the last 40 years. Now, I could obviously now go on to talk about electoral reform, which I'm glad to know I won't, but the underlying dynamic is that it's, for most MPs most of the time, unless you get drunk, say something stupid about the Queen on Twitter and get sacked by your local constituency, actually you don't worry that much most of the time about having to win votes. Now, undoubtedly many MPs in safe seats are nonetheless quite conscientious about their job and want to reach out to the public and so on, but the underlying dynamic in a way in British politics, the way the system works is that most of the time most MPs are not actually that worried about what the public think about them week in, week out. There are some plus points to that, no doubt, in terms of maybe it becomes easier to think longer term and so on, but it helps explain why often the take-up of new communications technologies, I think, seems relatively slow. The second, I think, underlying factor that's worth bearing in mind, you just think of a simple calculation. There's typically around 70,000 voters, 70,000 electors in a constituency. Imagine you're an MP or a candidate and you're wanting to persuade people to support you, or you're wanting to persuade them of a tricky issue and your view on that tricky issue. Maybe you therefore are going to spend 2 minutes talking to a person. And yeah, frankly, if you're trying to explain tuition fees policy and why it's actually not turning out that bad, you probably need more than 2 minutes. But let's say you take 2 minutes. If you spend 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 minutes per person, doing nothing else, all your eating, sleeping, trips to the toilet are outside that 8 hours a day, solid you're spending, so 8 hours a day, 7 days a week, 2 minutes per person, it takes you 292 days to work around everyone. And that is without doing anything else, without actually doing any of the other bits of being an MP or being a candidate. So the problem that most MPs and candidates at that level or at larger levels obviously face is there are too many voters to actually engage with them one-to-one. And that breaks two ways, I think, when we look at how technology is, the role it can play in politics and in campaigning, because what it means is technology that prefers one-to-one communication actually isn't really that helpful, because you run into that 292 days problem. Technology that lets you do one-to-many communication exceptionally helpful because it helps you break that 292-day problem. That's why, for example, I think instant messaging, lots of interesting things you can do with instant messaging never really took off in politics, because really instant messaging is about one-to-one or one-to-small number communications. It's also why email, despite being the boring, not fashionable, old technology that's been around for 40 years that nobody really gets terribly excited about, is actually the one that still delivers so many of the benefits and so often is the priority for parties and so on. I always used to say in the 2001 and 2005 elections, if we were to have a complete technology meltdown and either our website and everything related to that was going to be wiped out for the campaign, or the email system and everything compared to that was going to be wiped out for the campaign, please wipe out the website any day. Email, much, much more important. Partly because of this one-to-many, huge economy of scale. Julian can sit down one evening, write an email, send it to several thousand people, get to a mass audience. There is also, I think, the fact that email is very good at driving activity. I've recently sort of published a book, 101 Ways to Win an Election, available from all good online bookstores near you. And that's got me quite interested in just discovering a bit about how you promote books online. You'll notice, obviously, one of the lessons I've drawn from it is mention it as many times as possible face-to-face to people, one-to-many communication. But also, it is, I think, what you see with the book publishing industry is actually very similar to what you see with politics as well and so on, is that things like Twitter and Facebook and so on can be fantastic for reaching an audience, but if you want to get somebody to make a bit more of a commitment, like hand over some money to join a political party, hand over some money to buy a book, that extra level of commitment, email is extremely powerful. And the really successful campaigns obviously use email in conjunction with Facebook and Twitter and so on as a combined, but email has a major role to play. So I think there is this real tension between politicians and candidates and our political system needing one-to-many technologies, and how does social media fit with that? Because in some respects, social media is not very helpful. When people talk about how what's wonderful about Twitter is interactivity and all that, absolutely true, but if you're facing that 292-day problem, that's actually not a particularly helpful thing to hear. I think it's why Facebook has turned out to be so popular with so many MPs, almost more so than Twitter in many ways, because Facebook, you've got your page, you've got your profile, you can do that one-to-many communication in a way that to the recipients feels like it's actually much more personal, it's more like one-to-one. It's almost, Facebook almost, in a perfectly genuine way, actually allows you to fake the one-to-one communication in a one-to-many form. It's sort of hit that sweet spot, which is why, I think Facebook has become so popular. Twitter, it's got its uses, absolutely, but has generated less enthusiasm, and why in some ways Facebook has replaced blogging, because it does that sort of that one-to-many, but then all the aspects of social proof with friends forwarding messages on Verb and so on that works much better on Facebook than it does simply with blogging. And then the sort of final point I'd make, I think, about the context is simply that you can't, technology can't make the public interested in politics. It can make it a bit easier to contact an MP. It can make it a bit easier to find out about an issue. It can make it a bit easier to sign a petition. All of at the margins. But fundamentally, the way Facebook operates is you have to be interested in something to then want to interact with it on Facebook. You could be pushed a bit with ads and so on, but you have to be interested. Similarly with Twitter, you have to decide you want to follow someone on Twitter, and ads and retweets and so on can help make you a bit more aware of them and so on, but you have to want to. Just as you have to want to go to a political party website, you have to want to. And if there isn't that desire from the public, the technology really can't do very much. So I think those are the different sort of limiting factors. Now, the reason I picked those out as things to say is because, knowing who else is on the panel, I suspect everyone else will have lots of very positive things to say, which actually, frankly, I agree with as well. But rather than duplicating that, I think it's worth understanding those limiting factors. And in a way, I think the conclusion I would draw from that as to what the future of the technology and politics and so on is that firstly, it will overwhelmingly be determined by overall levels of public interest in politics. And that's the thing that will have a huge upsurge or not in online activity, interactivity. It's whether the public has that wider appetite. Technology can help generate the appetite a bit, but it's much more dependent on the appetite. And secondly, that it's the one-to-many form of communications that feel like they're one-to-one. That's the stuff that will continue to be the most popular and the most successful. So I hope you found that interesting. Likewise, I look forward to questions at the end.
Okay, so that's 3 perspectives on social media and politics from people on the outside. I'll hand over to Julian to give us a first-hand perspective as an MP who's been active on Twitter today, I've noticed. So over to you.
Well, thank you. You have 3 people who actually know what they're talking about and 1 who doesn't here. So, and it's slightly disconcerting to have this going on behind me, particularly when it says, apparently I've spoken about agriculture. I know basically nothing about agriculture, which is really quite alarming, actually. It's great to be here. I actually discovered, I guess a year or so ago, that essentially by coincidence, of all the current MPs, I was the first one on Twitter. Entirely, I used to be an academic, and it was entirely for academic purposes, and I didn't quite realise it in this context. It was actually one of our, sadly now, former councillors who told me I should get involved with Twitter when I was selected as a parliamentary candidate. It wouldn't take very long, and it might be useful. He was rather wrong. But I'll talk a bit about how Twitter works as an MP, and think back about the history of MPs. It's not that long ago. And I have to be very careful about giving dates here because there are people who will correct me every time I get them wrong. But a while back it was quite standard for MPs to have their annual trip to the constituency to check that it was still there. Well, I mean, there are a few MPs who do that now. I shouldn't critique any of them. There's only one MP from Labour who I believe has done no surgeries for 14 years, which is, I think says something about the safe seats issue. I do them every fortnight, 2 of them every fortnight. But it's not that long ago that people did that, and that was considered perfectly normal and acceptable. People didn't expect to see their MP. I've heard stories from a decade or 2 ago of the MP going, door knocking, and people pausing to put a tie on in order to open the door to the MP. That doesn't happen anymore, and I think that's probably a good thing. But it has changed. That whole communication style has changed over that time. People expect their politicians to be there. And there's been a lot of factors in that. TV has played a role, that people can see who this person is. They're not some mythical beast who you occasionally hear of when you are told who to vote for. And there's been a whole lot of sides. I mean, again, if you look at election campaigning in the past, it was all about songs. It was a very good way of communicating with people. I could go back even, but I could start with Greece if you really want to, a full history lesson, but it might take too long. Songs are quite important. Then we developed this concept of printing lots of things out and sticking it through lots of people's letterboxes and doing that again and again until they are so bored that they start repeating back the messages to get you to stop. But we now need to move on to other ways. And Mark's, of course, talked quite rightly about email and various other things. Facebook and Twitter are the 2 sexy ones. Simon, I'm afraid, knows what I'm going to say, which is I much prefer Twitter for my purposes than Facebook. But that's mostly because of the different relationships. I think MPs are obviously odd, but in one particular way MPs are a bit odd, is that there are lots of people who are quite interested in what we're doing every day, but I'm not necessarily that interested in what they're doing every day. Whereas Twitter, so Facebook has this friend model, which is very much more reciprocal, whereas Twitter very much more has this follower. It's not a very nice liberal model, actually. I don't quite like the concept of it sounds more like an authoritarian system where you have a hierarchical system. But nonetheless, Twitter works quite well for me. I do use Facebook as well, I hasten to add. But Twitter is something I use quite a bit. And actually, I find it quite fun. It gives me something to do when I'm stuck in a lift or in a boring meeting or whatever it might be. It's just to communicate. And I was trying to think, what do I actually use it for? Information is one of the key things. To me, it is the fastest way I know of finding out what's going on. I was in the Home Affairs Select Committee quizzing police about the whole Murdoch saga when there was a pie incident next door. We just heard a bit of a noise. Twitter within a second or so told me what had happened. I was the only person who knew there. It was wonderful. Information is power. If you have it before everyone else on the committee, you can make bets. Guess what? So information for me is incredibly useful. I can know what's happening very, very fast and hence be able to respond. That's useful in parliamentary debates as well. It's quite useful to be able to know what's happening there. Of course, I also use it to tell other people what I'm doing. And one of the reasons that I quite like that is to do with the structure of it. There's a very interesting network analysis that one can do on this. I say things, and for some reason, which I've never quite understood, there are people who want to know what I'm saying. But more powerfully, there are people who want to retweet what I'm saying. And so if I send out a message about cycling, which is something I do quite a lot of, because I'm quite interested in it. I cycled here to Brighton, if indeed. Lovely ride from London, if you've never tried it. If I talk about cycling, other people who care about cycling send it to all their mates who care about cycling. And so you can actually get messages to people I have never had any contact with, have never heard of me, but are interested in the issue. And there are very, very few other methods which allow you to get a message out to people who self-select to hear your message. And that is an incredibly powerful thing politically. It means that the things which I do obsess about, you got rid of that graph, do go to the people who also obsess about them. And that in itself is fantastic. You don't have the problem with delivering leaflets, of sticking the leaflet about schools to the people with no children, and so on. So that's useful. The other key thing is it does have that interactive nature, and that conversation is incredibly useful. People respond to what I'm saying, and I do engage with discussion with some of them. There is a bit of an issue on Facebook and Twitter and all of these things with trolls and people who are just actively abusive and unpleasant. So there are people who I actually just have stopped responding to because it's simply not worth it. But you can help. There are people who I've been dealing with who want to have help with an issue, with all sorts of issues. Just yesterday I recruited somebody to the party who I've only ever come across in Twitter. Is anyone in North West Derbyshire? You've got a new member. I hope you're happy. But there's that conversational element which can happen. There's a sense people can contact me to ask me things, and I do try to respond. I don't always do it, but I do try to. I also use it to consult people. So on a number of occasions where I've known, for example, I've had a Prime Minister's question coming up, I've tweeted out to say, all right, what do you think I should ask? Now, a number of the suggestions that came back were not really appropriate, shall we say. But there are also some absolutely brilliant questions. And while I didn't ask all of them, you're only allowed to do one, the rest, in some cases, then led on to other campaigns, because people raise issues where I hadn't known about that issue. That's really quite serious. I'll tackle it in a different way. I've used it, I was involved leading for the party in a debate about the Civil Aviation Bill. And in particular managed to secure environmental duty on the Civil Aviation Authority, which is quite useful. And I needed to understand some of the technical stuff, so I just put a tweet out saying, does anybody know anything about the details of aviation environmental stuff? And got a response back within 5 minutes from somebody who'd been retweeted this and come through somewhere saying, I'm an academic in Cambridge, that's exactly what I work on. It's fantastic. It would be very hard to find anybody like that in any other way. I've used it, I recently had the opportunity to propose a 10-minute rule bill, so a proposal for legislation. Again, got lots and lots of suggestions, ended up with one which is about protecting pubs and local independent shops. Very, very popular with people, and that's been quite useful as well. The other thing which I use it for is for transparency. People are very sceptical about politicians, all MPs are dishonest and so on and so forth. And people also think that MPs don't do very much, we're quite lazy. So just telling people all the meetings I'm having means that there are now a bunch of people who, when people accuse me of being quite lazy, they can say, no, he's not. There's a real sense of being quite busy. I've used that with other ways. There was a journalist, and I won't say who came to shadow me one day shortly after I'd been elected, and he gave up at about 5 o'clock, and I said about 5 hours to go. I let him go home, but I did say you can never ever write a story without me not working hard after that. There are some, I talked about the speed, there are some downsides of social media as well. It can be horribly inaccurate. It's not very good at self-correcting, it's not very good at checking, referencing. For example, there were stories about Maria Miller, you may have seen it, particularly actually on Facebook, by coincidence that I saw it, with a list of the hideous, she's new Equalities Minister, with all the hideous things she's voted for. How many people saw that message? How many people bothered to find out if any of it was true? Oh, that's good. I'm impressed, actually. I'm really pleased to see some hands about that. Because almost every single point that was made there was just factually false. There were votes that happened for when she wasn't an MP. I'm happy to criticise Labour or Tories for things they've actually done wrong, but things they haven't done are a little harsh. So there's a real issue about accuracy. There's the issue about trolls and abuse as well. We're still trying to work out some of the other uses. I've used it quite a bit as a campaigning tool. Some of you may remember there was an emergency motion about the Digital Economy Act just before the last general election, and we had an emergency motion which passed much to the shock of the leadership of the then MPs. And one of the reasons was that we used Twitter to get a message out on the basis that most people probably don't care about the digital economy very much, they don't know much about it, but the people who are on Twitter at Lib Dem Conference probably do. And we essentially managed to flood the hall with people who got it and won, which was marvellous. So we'll keep doing that every now and then, and please do show up tomorrow at just before 6 o'clock to vote in favour of Amendment 1. We'll try doing that online as well. We're trying to use it for recruiting, as I mentioned. We've managed to use it to get donations. We raised some money, not enough, just by asking people on Twitter. Worked surprisingly well. We're using it a little bit to do canvassing and a little bit else, but I think we still have to learn a lot more how to actually use it. But that engagement, that sense that people have a contact with their Member of Parliament, is really something very, very powerful. And hopefully it means I'll be able to hang on in Cambridge and talk to you again in a few years' time. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Julian, thank you very much. So now it's your chance for one-to-many communication. See a few hands up. So maybe what we'll do is take 3 questions at a time. And if I could ask you just to remind us of your name and where you've come from for your question, that would be great. So we'll start with France.
Okay. Hi, my name's Rachel Jolly. A lot of us saw Obama's campaign as the first great social media political engagement. But since then, his campaigning on social media seems to have taken a pretty downward slide. So can we take the conclusion therefore that it wasn't the social media that was great, it was actually the political moment? Or do you think that he has lost, or he and his team have lost the trick of knowing how to use social media?
Okay, so hold that thought. Second one, okay, the lady here. Oh, in the red, sorry.
Just picking up, Paola Bonadonna, I just wanted to pick up on what Julian said. It seems to me that although a lot of us, a lot of organizations and politicians are seduced by the fact that you can bypass the traditional media to get a message out, because the traditional media isn't interested anymore in a lot of cases. The problem you get with this unmediated communication is that anybody can do it, and if anybody can do it, you quickly find out that you're in a polarized universe where, you know, flat earthers get the same time, sort of, you know, rational individual. How do we overcome that?
Okay, and one more, gentleman up front.
Jonathan Brown, mainly for Julian. Well, not necessarily. How do you deal with not trolling so much, but so anybody has a website, someone posts a thing saying my particular case was dealt with terribly, I'm so upset. Thousands of people from an opposition party repost it. This could be for any party. So how do you as an MP deal with that kind of thing? Do you just ignore it and say, I can't respond to these types of posts?
Okay, Julian, do you want to take that one first, quickly, and then we'll go back through them?
Yes, okay. Well, the easiest solution to that is just to respond to all the casework quickly and never ever to generate bad comments.
But surely someone's going to get unhappy.
People to go, actually it doesn't happen that much for some reason. I don't quite understand why. When people are being difficult like that in a public place, they tend to be unreasonable. So I had one person who said ages ago, around the time of the election, just after, posted on Facebook saying, what do you think about welfare or something? And then an hour later, you can't be bothered to answer, you clearly don't care about anyone, I'm never talking to you again. And I think people saw that and thought, okay, that was an hour. It's not unreasonable to wait that long. So I haven't particularly dealt with that. And part of it's just you have to accept people being abusive and unpleasant and you know, difficult and critical. But actually engaging can help, and you can soften some people. Just this idea of sort of the flat earthers having a huge say sounds to me like the Daily Mail, actually. I don't see the difference massively. But there are some really interesting issues about the role of the citizen journalist. There's a guy, Richard Taylor, R. Taylor if you're looking, who follows every council meeting and everything that happens in Cambridge, reports on it on Twitter. And that is changing the dynamics. It means that things which nobody ever knew about are there suddenly reported. He's not all, I was going to say he's not always right, he sometimes says things I don't agree with, which is not necessarily the same thing. But that role is really changing. One of the other things I pick up, just one of the other downsides of Facebook and Twitter and anything like that, is it can become an echo chamber. That people end up talking only to the people that they agree with wholeheartedly. For what it's worth, I think that's why we lost the AV referendum, is we had messages which really, really persuaded people who supported AV already. And they're not the people we needed to target.
Okay. And we had a question about Obama, and was it social media, or was it just Obama and his personality? So, Simon,
I think one of the things from my US colleagues do tell me is that actually he has not been nowhere near as active while he's been in a non-campaigning phase. So, but it's beginning to tick up.
No, they are really active.
Well, no, he wasn't. In the period when he wasn't, when he was elected and there was no election, then he really didn't engage very much via Facebook, and therefore didn't bring people with him on that platform. I think we're beginning to see an uptick from both candidates. and we'll wait to see. I think it's a bit early now to write off social media in terms of the campaign. But no doubt about it, a lot of people who voted for him have fallen out of love with him, and therefore have not engaged with him in any sense, let alone on social media.
Okay, I'm going to... Yep, okay. Go on then.
I think on the Obama point, I think there's several issues at play there. I think the first is that the election in 2008 wasn't down to social media, but I think the most interesting element was the connection between social media and the real world, especially in terms of organization, and the organization specifically of volunteers, and the way technology integrated within actual campaigns. I think the second point is social media isn't a silver bullet. So the key thing is you need to have a good product, and you've got a big change in terms of context, which has had a big impact. The second, I think, in terms of scale, is while you have less examples of innovation, I think you have very good examples from the Obama campaign in terms of speed of issues. And the picture of the chair post, that weird thing they did at the Republican conference, that the Obama campaign posted afterwards, got widely posted. So I think there's various elements. I think the biggest element is that it reflects what happens in the real world. There's no difference between what.
Okay. Let me take a few more questions from the floor, so I'll start from at the back there. Okay, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Roger Harding from Shelter. It's a question particularly for Simon. You alluded to it earlier, which was Facebook in the US in the midterm elections did a really handy thing of having a function whereby you could record that you voted, and then friends were told that friends had voted.
Yep.
Quite impressive results in increasing turnout. So my question is whether you were planning to use that in 2015 in the UK election. And to link it to my day job at Shelter, the tenure trends in housing show that the number of people privately renting is rocketing up. Privately renters are substantially less likely to register themselves to vote. And I would imagine there's a big crossover between the demographic who rent and use Facebook.
Okay, so hold that thought and then let's take a couple more. Gentlemen behind.
A lot of the panelists have talked about, Gina Kakal from Jerry Langberger. A lot of panelists have talked about what politicians can do to proactively use social media. But actually, both politics and social media happens outside of politicians. I was wondering if the panelists could say a bit about how politicians can be reactive, especially in the context of what Louise mentioned, Twitter trolls, Hillary Clinton in terms of texting Hillary and the climate apology going viral, but also in terms of what Julie mentioned with regards to a lot of facts being put out, a lot of social media not actually being true, how politicians can counter the inaccuracies that are fed in the echo chamber.
Okay, one more. Let's lady at the front.
Thank you. I'm Marie Barker. I'm a borough councillor in Woking, and I use Twitter quite a lot. I use Facebook as well. I'm very much with the view of Julian in terms of just how useful Twitter is and all the different uses of that. But I kind of feel there's more I should be getting out of Facebook. I wonder what the panel think about what's the best sort of way of communicating for a local councillor on somewhere on a national stage, and whether it's a mix of all these different things or somewhere they should focus.
Okay, so a question about voting behaviour and how that works on Facebook. Question about how to do reactive activity on social media well, and the best way to communicate locally as well as nationally. So, Mark, maybe you'd like to...
Yeah, I guess just sort of thinking about a couple of those. In terms of the sort of how to be reactive bit, because I think it partly also links back to Jonathan's question from earlier, I think quite often I come across people, both inside and outside politics, including sort of clients in my day job as well, who say, sort of, should we be on Facebook, Twitter, social media, whatever? And almost always that's the wrong question. The point is you are on it. People are talking about you, your company, your product. The question is whether you want to take a part in that discussion. And so one thing that worked quite well with the Clegg apology video was by being on Twitter when there was the tweet from when the Pope wanted to get in touch to say, can we make this a charity single? Well, can we make this a single? And the Clegg team wanted to say yes, as long as you make a charity one. That could happen on Twitter in a way that was much more effective at getting the message over, actually for both of the halves of the conversation. So part of the answer about how to be reactive is you need to be there so you can respond in the way that is most appropriate to the medium. And also because if you're there and you're using it, you're more likely to know and to work out the way that's most responsive to the medium. And that also in a way partly gets back to, I think, the point about how to deal with trolling and negative feedback and so on, is people will say nasty things about you even if you're not there. But if you are there and if you've got your presence and it's partly happening on your terms, you can influence it much more. Just quickly on the point about, what sort of channel to use, what's the, so many different social media networks you could turn to, say as a local councillor, what's the best to use? If you're only going to pick one, I would pick email. I would say forget social media, email, partly because if you look at local councillors, for example, or ward candidates who have built up email lists, it's relatively, easy is maybe slightly unfair, relatively common, hard work, but relatively common for them to build up email lists that mean you've got something like 15% of your electorate on your email list. When you bear in mind there are more people in the household sort of that you indirectly get to via the email, that means you can sit down, send a message out, get to 20-25% of your electorate just like that. That is fantastically powerful, and you can do all sorts of different things. Yes, Facebook, Twitter, other things, lots of amazing uses you can do with that, but if you're going to pick one, definitely start with email.
Okay. Simon, I voted on Facebook.
Yeah, thanks very much for the question, Roger. It's something where when we see things work on Facebook, we always are keen to see if we could replicate them elsewhere in the world. It's a global platform. Sometimes local laws stymie us. So for instance, one of the things we've done in the States is done a voter registration app, so people can actually register to vote through Facebook, and we saw a fantastic uptake of that. However, we can't do it in the UK, for instance, because you need a wet signature for voter registration. We are in discussions with government about it. We'd love to try and do something about it, but it will mean it needs a change in the law to enable that kind of thing to happen. In terms of the 2015 election, that's a long way off, but watch this space. We're certainly always keen to see how we can help drive political engagement.
Okay. I'm going to take a few more questions because I know we're coming up against time, and I'll give everyone on the panel a chance to respond. So we've got 3 in the room. Brilliant. Gentlemen here.
You've all talked about using social media predominantly for communication, whether it's from can you just tell us a bit more, because I use it as a local research tool. I want to find out what people in my ward or in my borough are talking about. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that and the potential that what people might want to see?
Okay, thank you. Gentleman in the light blue.
Hi, Mark Thompson from Bracknell. Slightly playing devil's advocate here because I am very kind of techie switched on. I've been using computers since I was a kid. And I know that this isn't necessarily a problem yet, but I do fear a little bit as we move into the future about the people who are kind of excluded digitally, because we still do put leaflets through people's letterboxes, and I'm sure we will continue for a while. But I wonder if we may reach a tipping point where in the end so many people are online and on Twitter and on Facebook and on email that kind of dies, and then there may be a proportion of the population, maybe older people, or maybe just people who aren't very good with technology, who may find that they're not really engaged in the political process anymore.
Okay. And the lady behind the black and white.
That's my pocket doing the Thames ident.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi, Lola Tyner from Cancer Research UK. It's picking up on a couple of the earlier questions, and it's the flip side. So I think probably there are a few people in the room thinking about, and it's a £1 million question really, how can organisations, issues, campaigns interact with MPs and others and the public to cut through what kind of, as I say, it's a massive area, but some thoughts on that really in terms of effective campaigning.
Okay, thank you. So we've got a question about using social media and the web for research and finding out information. A question about whether actually this drive to moving communication online is leaving us open to issues around digital exclusion, and how do we use social media to interact better between campaigns, civil society, MPs and the public. So Alberto, would you like to kick us off?
I think the research question is actually to some extent linked to the question on using what do you do locally. My personal view is that it's wrong to say you should use all tools, or it's wrong to say you should use one tool. I think you should always start with what is the problem that you are trying to solve. So that could be researching, or that could be connecting with people locally, and then figuring out which of those tools are the best to do that. And I think it's also, I think Twitter, Facebook, email, YouTube, they're all fundamentally different. And one of the biggest mistakes which organizations and individuals make is to try and use them in very similar ways. So for example, posting their status update on Twitter, linking that to Facebook, for example. I think they're fundamentally very different tools. There are things that you can do on Facebook, such as connecting with people you know, such as organizing events, such as sending one-to-many communications. But there are other things, so for example, having an impact if someone says something false and you want to react immediately, or you want to connect with the media and journalists, it's much more useful to do that on Twitter than, say, via email, for example. So in terms of, there is no right or wrong way to use a tool. It's fundamentally, what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and starting with those problems, and then starting with and then figuring out how to use a tool for a solution. And very quickly, in terms of the issues with facts and research, I think lots of these issues aren't specific to social media, but there's issues which have to do with media. The dichotomy between on and offline media, I think, is a false one. So if you take a paper like The Express, in average, its headlines are inaccurate about 6 days a week. And you know, the key difference though is that when you look at when corrections are made, they have a tiny space. While it is true that on social media there are lots of inaccuracy, it is equally true that when records are set straight, they tend to be amplified, and that message tends to get communicated very, very widely. So I think it's a challenge, and the issues are very much to do with media in general, and it's how do we apply those rules and those principles to platforms which are fundamentally communication platforms. And the dynamics are different, but the challenge and issues are actually very, very similar.
Okay. Mark?
Yeah, taking up your point, Mark, about the sort of digitally excluded, I think there's a big difference between political campaigning and, say, being a councillor and worrying about how your council provides services. Because I think with political campaigning, it is more reasonable to prioritise who you're trying to contact and through which medium and so on. There's less of an issue about you have to feel that you give everyone an equal amount of information about why they should vote for you. So I think that makes it a little bit easier from that perspective. But it's worth bearing in mind, if you take the example of leaflets, there are plenty of people it is very hard to get to with leaflets. In fact, part of the reason why private renters are less likely to register and less likely to vote is precisely because they're often behind, for example, shared letterboxes, and you know what it's like, particularly in urban areas, huge public. And so they are, in that sense, sort of leaflet excluded, as it were, or you know, the private estates with the intercoms, with no letterbox, no tradesman's bell and all sorts. So it's not a new problem. It's one we should be aware of. It's one, I think, from a political campaigning perspective as opposed to a public service provision perspective. However, overall level of digital access and the overlap between that and likelihood to vote is so high that it's, yeah, the issue is much more that we're not using digital channels nearly as much as we could do, not what is the sort of theoretical limit of them. And just a final thought on how organisations can campaign and use this stuff. I think there is often a real trade-off between the organisation getting more supporters, more money, more sign-ups to its email list, more Twitter followers, and influencing the people you actually want to lobby. The classic example being 38 Degrees. Their very aggressive, let's fill up somebody's email inbox style of campaigning, brilliant for getting people on their email list. Pretty poor, I suspect. I'm sure Julian will be suitably diplomatic about 38 Degrees, but pretty poor very often at influencing MPs. And you often have to decide which of the two do you really want to do, or at least which of the two is the priority. Is it about building your list in whatever form it is? And often that will actually be the right thing to do. It's easy to see why 38 Degrees, at least initially, took that approach. But if you want to influence somebody at the other end, what you need to do is often subtly and importantly different.
I suppose one thought I'd like to leave you with is, if you think you know how to run a really successful social media campaign, you're almost certain to be wrong, because those platforms are changing all the time. We have a motto in Facebook that we're only 1% done. Facebook in a year's time will look completely different to how Facebook looks now, to how it looked a year ago. So one of the things you ought to do, if you're really committed to following this, is to like, in our case, like pages which tell you about the latest developments in Facebook. Well, we've just launched a new page called Facebook Stories, which is about people using Facebook for campaigning, the way in which Facebook has changed people's lives, the way academics are thinking about social media and Facebook. If you like those kind of pages, you'll get regular updates, and you will find out about new features on platforms like Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus that will enable you to use the most effective tools. And I think that's one of the most important things you should take away from this evening.
Okay, now a brief last word from Julian.
Thanks. I'll try and pick up just a couple of these things. Campaigning locally, I don't think it's any different from campaigning nationally. I've never really sort of thought through a strategy for social media campaigning. I've just done it, and it seems to have sort of worked. So maybe there's a lesson there that just try communicating, try to be yourself. Don't try to present somebody you're not. The one rule I have is I never talk about anything personal. Because I just to me there is a line. And I'm not sure that many people care what I have for breakfast, to be really honest. The issue about local research, I have used it to do sort of Twit poll type things, but not very often. One of the problems to be really, really aware of is the same as the digital exclusion issue, which is you're getting a very, very biased sample. I was at a Think Foundation of Science and Technology about social media, and one of the other speakers, Mike Lynch from Autonomy, started off by asking people if they'd ever heard of the phrase om nom nom. Now, I suspect there'll be a lot of people here. Ask that question on Twitter and you'll find almost universal yes, because there's a set of people who do things on Twitter, so you have to be very careful that you're not just asking a very small subset of people what they think, and that's really dangerous. The digital exclusion reminds me, I don't know how many of you read Liberator. You ought to be subscribers. Even if you're not party members, you can subscribe. And there's a Lord Bonker's diary on the back page. I have to be careful. I'm not going to use any words like plebs in anything I say. But there was a lovely comment, life would much easier if this were true, just around the election time, where it says, at 6 a.m. all the residents lined up to collect their good morning leaflets. We don't have a system like that. You will never have a perfect way of getting these things out. You just use as many different things as you possibly can. Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So it's been a really, really interesting conversation. I'm afraid we're going to have to call it there because we are out of time. All that remains is to thank all of you for coming and to thank the panel, Mark, Simon, Alberto and Julian for joining us.